Hello, tonight. Come with me on another journey back through time. Before we begin, let the noise of the day fade gently away. Let the room grow quiet. And let your imagination open softly in the night. Tonight, we return to Amsterdam in the 1600s, a city of water, wind, merchant ships, canals, and narrow streets. But this is not the quiet postcard city people imagine today. This is Amsterdam in the midst of rapid growth, expanding with extraordinary force, as if it is trying to gather the whole world into its harbors and warehouses. Together, we will move beyond its beautiful facades and into the reality of daily life, discovering not only its beauty, but also the cost behind its splendor. And before we begin, tell me where you are listening from tonight. And now, if you are ready, let us walk down to the water's edge, where 17th century Amsterdam is waiting in the thin mist of early morning. Before Amsterdam entered the memory of later generations as a city of arched bridges, narrow facades, and tall windows looking down upon still water, it first appeared as a place being raised out of mud, wind, wood, and water. If you stood at the edge of that city on an early morning in the 17th century, when the northern sky still held a pale silvery gray like cold ash, the first thing you would feel would not be beauty, but motion. The water was not still. The air was not still. The city was not still. Everything seemed to breathe in one long, urgent rhythm, as if all of Amsterdam were growing before your eyes. Dawn did not arrive here in a sudden blaze, but in the gentlest shift in the color of the mist. Across the water, cargo boats were already moving before the sky was fully bright. They glided low and heavy, carrying peat for fuel, timber for building, rope, cloth, grain, salted fish, and goods from places far beyond any horizon the eye could reach. Great ships anchored in the harbor rested like enormous dark masses, while smaller vessels slipped deeper into the city like blood through veins. From a distance, the masts thickened into a dark, upright forest against the brightening sky. Ropes stretched taut, wood groaned and creaked, and water tapped softly against the hulls. All of it blended into a sound that was not loud in the way of war, but steady like a machine that had been working for a very long time and had no intention of stopping. Amsterdam in the 1600s was a city of water, but not the kind of water meant only to be admired in silence. Here, water was a road, a harbor, a means of transport, a tool of wealth, the reason the city existed, and also a challenge people had to master day after day. The land was soft, low, and damp. It did not wait ready-made to receive stone streets or grand houses. Human hands had to force it into order with wooden piles, embankments, canals, patient calculations, and tireless labor. Perhaps that is what gave Amsterdam its peculiar beauty. It did not feel like a city that had grown naturally, but like an act of will hammered into the earth on thousands of timber posts, then slowly rising above the cold water. As the morning brightened, the city revealed itself more clearly. Wharf edges, wooden bridges, warehouses, slightly leaning roofs, and tall, narrow facades seemed to rise little by little from the mist. You could imagine yourself walking near the harbor, where people had long since begun working before the upper windows had even opened. There were porters, sailors, clerks, messengers, buyers, and even those who merely watched, yet somehow still seemed in a hurry. no one needed to speak loudly. This city did not need to shout for you to know it was busy. It was enough to see how everything moved toward something. And you would understand that this was a place where time was measured not only by church bells, but by the tide, by the hour ships arrived, by news from the sea, and by the speed of money. As you moved farther inward, you would feel that Amsterdam was not merely a place where ships came and went, but a place where the whole world seemed to be finding its way ashore, from shipholds, warehouses, and wooden crates just pried open. The air carried scents strange to a northern city: cinnamon, cloves, pepper, exotic woods, tar, newly twisted rope, and cloth still holding the smell of the sea. None of these smells stood apart. They wound together in the cold morning air and passed over you like invisible proof that Amsterdam did not live only by what lay around it. It was feeding, breathing, and growing rich through long connections stretching across the ocean to lands most people in this city would never see with their own eyes. And then the city widened into another layer still, from the harbor waters, from the ships and warehouses. The current of motion led deeper inward to places where goods became numbers and news became opportunity. You did not need to understand every ledger or contract to feel what was happening in Amsterdam at that moment. It was enough to stand in the middle of its rhythm to realize that this place did not trade only in merchandise. It also traded in anticipation. Ships not yet returned had already created rumor, hope, anxiety, and calculation. A strong wind in a distant sea, a newly opened port, a cargo arriving on time. All of it could alter the fortunes of those standing in these cramped, narrow streets. Perhaps that is why Amsterdam did not possess the quiet magnificence of a palace capital. It carried instead the taut energy of a city poised between order and overload. More and more people came here. The city grew faster than its own ability to rest. New districts were opened, new canals drawn, new banks reinforced, as if Amsterdam were pulling itself wider to make room for the future, seen from above. The curving and straight lines of water formed a deliberate structure, a kind of geometry laid over soft ground. But standing below, in the chill of early morning, it felt entirely different, not geometry, but living rhythm, not a map, but human breath, the sound of wood, the smell of water, the weight of goods, and the endless patience of labor. The canal houses at that hour were quieter than the harbor, but they too had begun to take part in the great machine. Their tall, narrow facades reflected the pale light of morning, while the glass windows held on to a little of the warmer darkness inside. Houses in Amsterdam were built close together, as if each had to struggle to claim its place in a city where land could never be wasted. They were taller, narrower, more compact, and seemed always to lean slightly toward the water. Some had hooks fixed at the gables, ready to hoist goods up to the upper floors. Even the architecture told you that this was a city of trade. Houses were not built merely for living. They were also storehouses, vaults for profit, and extensions of the harbor and the ledgers. If you continued along a canal at that hour, you would see bridges spanning the water like brief resting points between streams of movement. People crossing did not linger. Carts passed by, wooden clogs struck against the planks. A man dragged a coil of rope. A boy carried something wrapped in cloth. A woman stood in her doorway looking toward the water for a few seconds before turning back inside. This city had moments of stillness, but its stillness never lasted. It always felt as though, in another moment, everything would shift forward again. That was what made 17th century Amsterdam so compelling. It was not only beautiful to look at, but beautiful because beneath that outward appearance you could feel force, energy, and the sense that something was always arriving. And perhaps Amsterdam knew that about itself. It was not a city born of long-settled calm. It was the result of ambition, commerce, engineering, and bold decisions that sought to turn a low, damp, cold stretch of land into the center of a changing world. Here, people did not merely live beside water. They negotiated with it every day. They cut it into canals, forced it to serve transport, and used it to connect house to harbor, harbor to warehouse, warehouse to market, market to distant oceans. That gave the city a quality at once fragile and proud. Fragile, because everything had been raised on difficult ground. Proud, because by human effort and intelligence, what seemed a disadvantage had been turned into a source of wealth. By now, as the sun rose higher and the light spread across the rippling water, Amsterdam no longer resembled a dim shape in the mist. It came fully into view, sharper, busier, more defined. The canals became bright silver passages threading through the city. Harbor edges stood out more clearly. Windows caught the light. Bridges linked one rhythm to another. Somewhere, a cargo had just been unloaded. Somewhere else, a decision had just been entered into a ledger. A ship was preparing to leave the harbor. A warehouse door had just been opened. News from the sea was already on its way. There was not a single moment in that whole picture when everything stood still. From a distance, people might be bewitched by the neatness of the house fronts reflected in the water, but once you came close enough, you realized that the true soul of the city lay elsewhere. It lay in the feeling that everything was always being lifted, hauled, carried, recorded, calculated, sold, exchanged, and built anew. It lay in the small boats slipping between great warehouses, in footsteps on the bridge at dawn, in the smell of spice mingling with the smell of cold water, and in the silent timber piles beneath the ground, holding up an urban dream that was growing larger day by day. And perhaps that is the truest way to enter Amsterdam in the 1600s, not by seeing it as a finished painting, but as a living creature, expanding, working, and writing its own destiny out of water, before it became a symbol of wealth, of paintings, of the famous canals that still endure today. It was a cold morning, a harbor full of thin mist, a forest of dark masts, a city raised little by little between mud and wind, and a vast belief that from this low, damp, fragile place, human beings could still create a center of the world. Tonight, as we have just set foot in that Amsterdam rising from the water, perhaps you too can feel that this city did not rest in the way old cities are often imagined to rest. It lived by the rhythm of the tide, of labor, of ships, and of ambition. It was beautiful, but that beauty was never separated from the weight of work pressing down on every timber post, every quay, every house. And it is from that very beginning, from that cold and moving water, that Amsterdam truly enters its own story. If, in the previous chapter, Amsterdam appeared as a city rising from the water, breathing through ships, goods, and harbors that never rested, then, in this chapter, we slow our steps a little, We leave behind the broad waters and the masts thick as a forest, and draw closer to the houses reflected in the canals. There, very quickly, something fascinating begins to emerge. The splendor of 17th century Amsterdam never lay only in its tall, narrow facades, its gleaming windows, or the little steps that lifted the wealthy above the street. It also lay in the way people lived inside those walls, more intimate, more crowded, less private, and far more real than the picture-perfect city later generations often chose to remember. Imagine a morning already fully bright, when silver light on the canal begins to spill across the windows. You stand before a house along the water. Its facade is narrow and tall, as though forced upward because the ground is too precious to spread wide. The front door is not shut tightly like that of a modern home in 17th century Amsterdam. Houses were far less private. Front doors often stood open, and there was nothing unusual about children, neighbors, or familiar faces coming and going. A house was not a sealed shell shutting out the world. It was more like part of the street itself, a place where sound, glances, gossip, footsteps, and the rhythms of other lives could always reach inside. In such a place, family life was never entirely hidden behind brick walls. It remained close to the street, inside. Light entered in long vertical streams through the tall windows. It fell across the floor, the legs of chairs, the edges of wooden tables, and onto objects kept with care not only for their usefulness, but because they reflected the dignity of the family who lived there. Yet the first feeling inside such houses was perhaps not luxury in the sense of display. It was order. The Dutch of the 17th century cared deeply about cleanliness, but their idea of what was clean was not quite the same as ours. People did not bathe frequently in the way we imagine today. Instead, neatness and hygiene were closely tied to fresh, light-colored linen, especially white linen, a crisp collar, a clean layer of cloth against the skin, a tidy outward appearance. These too were ways of saying that one was respectable, disciplined, and clean. And if you move a few steps farther in, you begin to see the difference between beauty arranged for display and the real life required to sustain it. In the wealthy canal houses, everything at the front seems meant for the eye. Reception rooms, fine furniture, porcelain, paintings, fabric, light, and order. But behind that surface, another world is quietly at work. Petronella Ortmann's Doll's House offers an astonishing glimpse of this hidden reality. It was not a child's toy, but a display of wealth and refined taste. Inside, every detail is so realistic that it includes storage rooms, a laundry room, a working kitchen, a show kitchen, and even running water. It reminds us that a beautiful house does not run on beauty alone. It depends on fires being lit, water being carried, laundry being washed, food being prepared, children being tended, and countless small tasks that never truly end. If you gaze at that doll's house long enough, upper-class Amsterdam begins to appear not as a gentle dream, but as a carefully organized machinery of daily life. There are rooms for receiving guests, rooms for displaying porcelain, a place where a mother recovering from childbirth may rest for weeks, kitchens that display abundance, and real kitchens where life unfolds amid fire, smoke, water, and fatigue. This matters because it shows that the city did not live only on money drawn from the sea. It also lived on labor within every house. Behind a beautiful curtain is someone who has just changed the bed linens. Behind a porcelain vase is a pair of hands that dusted it in the early morning. Behind a neatly laid meal is a whole chain of work, usually carried by women, servants, maids, and those who rarely appear in elegant portraits. Leaving the houses that face the canal, we move to the back of the city, where beauty softens and life becomes more visible. The expansion of the canal belt also made social hierarchy more sharply defined. The elite lived along the broad canals in imposing houses. Stepping up to front doors raised slightly above the street, but the city did not consist only of that polished front. Kerkstraat, the long, straight street behind it, functioned like the backstage entrance to the canal belt. There were carriage sheds, workshops, servants' quarters, laundries, delivery men, peat carriers, and all the labor needed to keep the facades at the front beautiful and quiet. If the Amsterdam at the front was a stage, then Kerkstraat was where the scenery was changed, the fires lit, and the props carried in. It is in streets like these that you begin to smell the city more clearly. Not only the scent of wood, cloth, soap, or cooking food, but also the smell of peat, the fuel that was vital for heating homes. Peat was brought by boat from the marshlands around Amsterdam into back streets like Kerkstraat, and with it came a heavy, damp smoke that clung to the air. On a cold afternoon, when peat burned in kitchens and fireplaces, that smell would seep into curtains, wood, coats, staircases, and slowly follow people back out into the street, no matter how beautiful a city may be. Once you truly live inside it, it will always carry the smell of fuel, of survival, of the very thing that helps people endure the cold. And then there was water. Few places made water feel both everywhere and strangely absent, quite the way Amsterdam did. Canals and rivers surrounded the city, yet clean drinking water was not easy to obtain. Water within the city was often brackish, so better fresh water had to be brought in by boat and sold by the bucket. Cheaper rainwater was collected in shared cisterns along the street. Only wealthier families had their own private tanks. That meant an important part of life lay not in grand events, but in small daily decisions. Where to get water, which kind to use for cooking, which for washing, and which had to be saved. In a city of water, water still had to be carefully managed. So if you stood long enough on a street corner in 17th century Amsterdam, you would see domestic life reveal itself in small things. A woman stepping out with a wooden bucket, another deciding whether to use rainwater or water bought from a boat, children passing a shared cistern, an argument flaring up because someone had taken too much. The city traded with the world, yet within every house. Life still depended on practical knowledge repeated day after day, knowing which water was for what, when to save, when to wait, and when to yield. Few things capture real life more truthfully than such small and repeated forms of knowledge. Now, let us return to the canal, but not as we saw it before. When we first arrived, the water seemed full of ships and trade. Now it appears closer to daily life and less poetic. The canals were not merely a magnificent backdrop. Women washed clothes by the water. Toilets were built over the canal from the bridges. The waterways that reflected the sky also received waste, dirty water, and the smells of the city's ordinary life in summer. The smell could grow so heavy that many wealthy residents left Amsterdam for a time. Even the trees planted along the canals helped soften that odor. It is a distinctly Amsterdam detail. Beauty was never entirely separate from utility, and elegance was never fully free from the slightly unpleasant realities of urban life. That is why, if you look closely, 17th century Amsterdam is not two separate worlds, one luxurious, one grimy. It is those two layers laid directly on top of each other. The facades are tall, bright, and orderly. Behind them are the footsteps of servants, the rumble of fuel carts, the sounds of workshops, washing, pots and pans, children, and the smell of the real city. The wealthy lived a little higher, a little more spaciously, a little more discreetly. Yet they could never completely separate themselves from the systems of labor and service that sustained the whole neighborhood. A spotless white collar could exist only because someone washed it. A beautiful drawing room could exist only because someone swept it, lit the fire, carried the water, emptied the ash, and shut the doors each night. Beneath the order of Amsterdam were countless quiet hands at work. And perhaps that is what makes this chapter so memorable when we speak of beautiful facades. The fascination lies not simply in their beauty, but in how many moving rhythms they concealed behind them. A canal house was not merely a symbol of the Dutch Golden Age. It was a small body within the larger body of the city, with one part exposed to be seen, and another hidden to keep everything running. Inside there was pale light on brick floors, clean linen, open doors, closeness without privacy, real heat from the kitchen, carefully rationed water, the smell of peat, and tasks repeated every day, and beneath all of it was one deeply human truth. Lasting beauty rarely creates itself. It is maintained by labor, by habit, by order, and by things so small that people often forget them when they stand outside and only look in. If the first chapter brought us into Amsterdam through the movement of the city, then this chapter keeps us there through its warmth and through the cramped intimacy within it. We have crossed the threshold, gone around to the back, and bent nearer to the water, the peat, the hearth, and the hands that never stop working. By now, Amsterdam is no longer simply a city of trade. It has become a place where human beings truly live, eating, washing, heating, raising children, receiving guests, quarreling, enduring smells, preserving appearances, and trying to make life look a little more orderly in the midst of a city growing far too quickly. Behind those beautiful facades, Amsterdam appears no less beautiful, but it is the beauty of a life with weight, with labor, with household rhythms, and with all the things that do not sparkle, yet still make up the soul of the city. At a certain point, after you have walked long enough along the canals of Amsterdam, your eyes begin to believe that this city was made to reflect light. Light rests on the water, on glass windows, on tall, narrow rooftops, on crates newly arrived at the harbor, on clean linen, and on rooms kept in careful order. From the outside, everything seems balanced, almost serene, and that is where this final chapter begins, at the moment when beauty grows soft enough to lull the listener into peace, only to reveal that behind that golden glow lay a weight 17th century Amsterdam could never fully hide. Even UNESCO's description of the Canal Belt reminds us that this was not simply a beautiful city, but a deliberately created port city. An urban machine built to transport, accumulate, and expand power. If you stood on a bridge late in the afternoon, You would understand why later generations called this a golden age. The canals grow quieter, the water holds long bands of light, and the houses along the banks seem to lean toward their own reflections. The city appears wealthy, mature, and almost effortlessly self-assured. But that feeling is true only if we choose to see Amsterdam as its winners preferred it to be seen, as a place of prosperity, art, commerce, and order. The Amsterdam Museum has made clear that this image of a peaceful and prosperous 17th century was shaped in part by those who benefited from it, while the stories of war, violence, and conflict were softened or pushed aside. To understand Amsterdam as it truly was, we have to look beyond the surface. Those tidy facades reflected in the water belonged not only to families who lived with order, but to a city bound to sea routes that were long, profitable, and often brutal. At the East India House, the directors of the VOC discussed distant voyages, trade strategy, and military operations. Inside those rooms were secret maps, heavy ledgers, and decisions made far from the lands that would suffer their consequences. The Stadsarchief reminds us that the wealth one could almost smell in the city, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, timber, resin, reached Amsterdam through oppression, exploitation, and violence elsewhere in the world. That truth feels especially bitter because spices are so easily linked with warmth. A meal scented with cinnamon, a storeroom full of fragrance, a precious cargo resting in the cool dark of wood. Yet behind that fragrance lay coercion many in Amsterdam may not have seen, or may not have wished to see. After the conquest of Banda in 1621, much of the population was killed, expelled, or enslaved. Nutmeg and mace were then harvested on new plantations by enslaved people and other forced laborers under VOC control. Some of the most refined things in Amsterdam had origins so steeped in destruction that they can only be understood as products of a system of violence organized with chilling efficiency. And it was not only the distant East that stood under this shadow. At the West India House, Amsterdam opened another door toward the Atlantic after Dutch Brazil was lost. Curaçao became a major center in the Dutch-controlled slave trading network. And from the West India House, the Amsterdam Chamber directed much of that traffic across the wider system. The Dutch forcibly transported around 500,000 Africans to the Caribbean and the colonies in the Americas. The number is almost too vast to imagine, which is perhaps why it feels even more terrifying. No matter how elegant a city may appear, it can still serve as a working link in a world where human beings are turned into cargo, ledger entries, and profit. Once you begin to think this way, Amsterdam in the evening light changes almost imperceptibly. The windows still shine, the water still trembles softly, but beauty no longer feels innocent. It begins to carry the sense that this city was built not only with brick, timber, and piles driven into the earth, but also with vast distances between the place where profit was enjoyed and the place where pain was endured. A decision in Amsterdam might have been only a few signatures or a few lines in a ledger far away. It could mean seized land, forced crops, coerced labor, or an entire community driven from the life it had once known. What makes this past so heavy is not only that violence existed, but that it could be dressed so beautifully it nearly vanished from shared memory. Yet the price of Amsterdam did not lie only beyond the horizon. It also lived within the city itself, a dense, wealthy city, broadly connected and constantly in motion. Always, carries its own fragility. People could control water through canals, goods through warehouses, finance through ledgers, but never disease. Until 1667, Amsterdam was struck again and again by plague. And in the outbreak of 1663 to 1664, nearly 25,000 people died, about 10% of the population. The authorities responded mainly by isolating the sick, their families, and their homes from 1635 onward. There was even a new plague house at Overtoom, outside the city limits. Pause on that for a moment. A city full of spices, goods, and profit also lived with the fear of marked doors, quarantined families, and streets people crossed with unusual caution. In the homes we visited earlier, with their warm kitchens and clean linen, plague entered like an unwelcome darkness. It did not completely spare rich or poor. Though overcrowding and harsher living conditions made some far more vulnerable than others, it reminded Amsterdam that a city could succeed brilliantly in drawing the world into its harbor, and yet remain defenseless against what moved invisibly from person to person, ship to ship, street to street. Perhaps the saddest thing was the coexistence of two opposite rhythms. On one side, commerce had to continue. Ships still arrived and departed. Contracts were still signed. Spices still weighed. Cloth still sold. Ledgers still closed at day's end. On the other side, fear threaded through daily life. Who was coughing? Which house had stayed shut too long? Which street had seen a death? Whether this season would be worse than the last. Amsterdam was never a still painting of wealth. It was a place forced to earn and endure at once, to display stability while living with a constant undercurrent of unease. And it is there that the so-called golden glow shows its truest nature, not as serenity, but as a thin layer of light cast over immense labor, immense worry, and immense suffering kept just outside the frame. When night fell over Amsterdam in the 1600s, the city remained beautiful in its own way. Lamplight spilled from windows. The water darkened, still holding the shadows of bridges and rooftops. Movement softened into a quieter murmur. Passing a canal house at such an hour, one might still think this was the height of Northern European urban civilization, orderly, wealthy, skillful, and full of confidence. But by then, perhaps, we can already see what the light alone does not say, that this beauty existed beside plague, hierarchy, colonial networks, slave trading, and decisions made calmly in elegant rooms that nevertheless reached into the lives of countless human beings elsewhere. So if anyone asks what it was really like to live in Amsterdam in the 1600s, the answer should not be too simple. It was not only splendid, it was not only harsh, it was to live in a city that had become modern too early, where beauty and systems of power moved side by side, where art and commerce illuminated one another, yet where the distance between facade and consequence had grown immense. You could walk across a beautiful bridge, breathe in the scent of spices, pass clean and orderly houses, and believe that you stood at the center of a world opening outward. And that would be true. Only that world had opened at a far heavier cost than the still waters of the canal allowed anyone to see at first glance. And now, as our journey through 17th century Amsterdam comes gently to an end, Perhaps you have already felt that this city was never merely a beautiful place to admire from afar. Tonight, we moved through an Amsterdam shaped by water, ships, trade, and restless motion. We saw its narrow facades, its canals, and the closeness of daily life hidden behind its polished appearance. But we also glimpsed the other side of that prosperity: disease, inequality, and the human cost behind the city's wealth. Perhaps that is why Amsterdam in the 1600s remains so memorable, not because it was perfect, but because it was vivid, human, and real. If you enjoyed this journey, leave me a message and tell me which city or time period you would like to visit next. And if you are still awake, share which part of tonight's story stayed with you most. For now, thank you for walking with me through the bridges, canals, and old streets of Amsterdam. I wish you a peaceful night, a deep and restful sleep, and the gentlest of dreams.